Today, in round 4 of the candidates tournament in Moscow, we had a battle between two of the leaders. Sergei Karjakin from Russia played against Viswanathan Anand from India. And this is a real battle of the generations. Karjakin, 26 years old, Anand, 46 years old. Extraordinary 20 years between these two players. Now, I think of both of these players having a very kind of classical style, very responsible players. But Karjakin clearly wanted to kind of unbalance Vishy today, and he played a slightly unusual opening. And to some extent he succeeded, because the position they reached was a little bit unusual. And, well, let's take a look at this. So Karjakin with the white pieces, and you can see that he's managed to give Anand these hanging pawns. Now, normally these hanging pawns are completely sound, completely playable. But here it's a little bit different, because Anand has also had to advance the f-pawn. And in combination with the hanging pawns, he's taken on a lot of responsibility here. And it means that if things go badly wrong, there is a huge hole behind these pawns, and that affects Black's king. Now, Black is not without chances here, because you can see that Karjakin has advanced pawns on the king side, which means that these light squares are somewhat weaker. And maybe Anand's best is simply to push the king into the corner and go for this d4 advance to open up the bishop. But somehow, I think Vishy kind of realised that he'd already played a little bit inaccurately and kind of lost his nerve here. And he decided to simplify the position with bishop a6. But I think this is a fundamental mistake in the position, and Karjakin said afterwards that he was very happy with this move, because after exchanging, it's much easier for White to play than Black. White does not have to worry about his king now. He can concentrate on putting pressure on these pawns, and also, Black has to watch out for his king. So let's see how Karjakin did it. First of all, a very neat little move. Queen c3. I like this move a lot. It's basically just taking this diagonal, looking at that weakened e5 square. And then rook c1. So you can see that White's piece is very nicely placed. Nice harmony. So they're starting to put pressure on these pawns in the middle. Queen d6, and now knight e5. Now this kind of emphasizes White's positional advantage, because first of all that knight slots in between these two pawns. That's a weak square, very weak square, and threatens to come to c4, forking queen and rook. Remember, there's a pin here, so that's very typical for these kind of positions. Always pins with hanging pawns, so that rook had to drop back. Now knight d3, very nice. Already putting pressure on the pawn on c5. Now if Vishy were to defend that with a rook, kind of be the normal move, then knight f4 starts to put pressure on the other pawn. But also that knight could at some point spin to h5, looking at the g7 pawn. Remember what I said about that queen on that beautiful diagonal, and we can see that that pawn on f5 really creates terrible weaknesses. It needs to be back on f7, where it protects the king and can also block potentially with f6. So in this position, instead of protecting that pawn, Anand advanced it. He's hoping to simplify the position, but, well, Karjakin exchanged and just played queen e5, a very cool response. Karjakin's judgment was excellent. He realised that even after the exchange of queens, he has massive positional advantage. Now Anand has to exchange here if the rook slips across to a4, which of course you'd like to do to put pressure on the a pawn. Then White takes on d5, and you're through to Black's king. This is really nasty. Of course, if that's taken, then rook c8 and is mate. So Anand exchanged. Again, black's piece is very passive. If the knight were to come to g6, you could come in with a rook, and at h5, and this position is almost Zugzwang. Black can't move the king. If that pawn advances, well, you put the pawn on h6. You can see these pieces can't move at all. Desperate. Or if rook b3 trying to activate, too slow. White is already in with rook c7, hitting these pieces. And you'll notice, just compare the kings as well. White's king perfectly safe. That pawn on f2 is very important. That pawn on f5 exposes the king. So Anand played g6, so he wants to step up. Rook c5, Karjakin starts to take control. Excellent move. That rook hitting the d-pawn and about to swing to a5. This is the perfect position for the rook. You can, well, there's this classical principle in endgames that if your opponent has two weaknesses, then usually that will be enough for you to force a win. And well, we're about to see that's the case here. Anand brought the king up and the knight came back, but it's swinging around to decent squares again, perhaps here, perhaps c5. Rook c7, black is still passive, and rook a6. This is the point, there's no pawn cover for the king, so it has to step back. If rook c6, you can take the pawn, or knight c6, you pin with knight b4. So the king has to step back, and you can see it's cut on the 6th rank here. Knight f4, threatening a fork. This knight torments king and rook over the next few moves. Black's still completely passive. And now king f1, very simple. So if black does nothing, there is the potential threat simply to bring the king into the position. Anand tries knight g8. Now, this is something of forlorn hope, but if the knight gets to e4, you can see that's a little bit of counterplay. But Karjakin very cleverly doesn't continue with his king march, instead snuffs out this possibility, and knight d4. The point is, if knight f6, then knight c6 threatens the a-pawn, but also knight e5 check, yet another knight fork. So the knight had to come back to c7 to cover c6. Now knight b5, hitting the pawn. The knight came back to defend, and now again super solid from Karjakin, just protecting that knight. And that means that after rook b7, Karjakin is free to play this rook c6, hitting the knight. Now this is desperate. If the rook comes back, yet another knight fork. Or if knight b6, then knight fork. I'm like a broken record now. So Anand has to play knight e7 to hit the rook, otherwise knight d6 would win straight away. So rook a6, hitting the a-pawn. The knight comes back. So Karjakin is just playing cat and mouse at the moment. He's just repeating the position to get to the time control, but also showing who's boss as well. And now he deviates with rook d6. Doesn't want to repeat for the third time, of course. So just keeping absolute control, so Anand doesn't get out of this. And now, well, they've reached the time control. I think Anand realised that, well, of course, he knew he was lost here. If he waits, then one very simple winning idea is just to step up the board with white's king. Now rook a6 drags the knight back, which leaves the way clear for the king. So the king, well, it could simply mop up on d5, or it could step in, force the rook back, and then you can take the a-pawn. That's a good song, actually, Duke Ellington. let's go back. Rook. Instead of waiting, Anand, well, he knew that he would lose after this, but he just wanted a quick end. Rook d7. Of course, he didn't exchange. Seized 7th rank, hitting the a-pawn, which moved forward, and then knight c3. And after this, Anand resigned. King e6, yet another knight fork. And, well, otherwise, white just takes here. Let's say rook here, and rook e6, knight d5, and then, utterly winning. You take on e7. Well, great technique from Karjakin, and I was also very impressed with the way that he managed to unbalance Anand and get the kind of middle game that suited himself, Karjakin, and made Anand feel very unsettled. Let me just show you very quickly part of another game, Caruana against Topalov. Here, basically, they're in time pressure, but Caruana is taking control. You can see Topalov has a bit of play on the king side, but this bishop covers very nicely, and White's pieces looking really solid. The king actually very safe, and now Caruana started to use his control on the queen side, and he's looking at the weak d pawn. Probably Topalov should exchange here, but White has, I think, an excellent position, big positional advantage. Instead, in time pressure, Topalov played queen e7, and that allowed this hit. Knight takes d6, because if the bishop takes on b1, then simply knight takes rook is winning. So in desperation, Topi took on h3. Okay, it's a free piece, and then rook f6. Okay, he's trying to complicate somehow, but this is utterly winning. The knight hits the queen, which came back. Now they've reached the time control, so Caruana has plenty of time to think things through, but this is not difficult. If he'd used his time, of course, he'd have taken on f6. And after queen f6, don't forget this is still attacked, and so's this, but of course you just step up. And White is a piece up here. Now there's a few little things to negotiate with e4, for example, that hits this, but actually after rook e2, White is completely safe. There's also a little tactic here. If bishop f5, wanting to recover the piece, in fact, of course, you can just take that. Yet another knight fork. That seems to be the theme of today, and you win. But instead of this, very quickly, Caruana played rook b5. Now this is really bizarre. I mean, maybe he'd imagined that Topalov would just take the knight, and after this, well, okay, White is winning this position. But instead, Topi took on f2, and suddenly it's complicated. The game went like this: rook takes bishop, rook takes, and, well, this is still very good for White, but Topalov actually managed to save the game. Caruana must be kicking himself. So, well, it was a present to Topalov on his 41st birthday, so happy birthday, Vasilin Topalov. Well, that meant that there were 3 drawn games today, only one victory, Karjakin's victory over Anand. So Karjakin now takes sole lead after 4 rounds with 3 points out of 4.